On a humid, suffocating afternoon in the summer of 1894, a massive column of oily, black smoke began to rise over the south side of Chicago. It was a sight that stopped the city in its tracks. People stood on their porches, shielding their eyes, watching as the horizon turned a bruised purple. Just 1 year earlier, this exact location had been the center of the known universe. This was the site of the White City, a sprawling, breathtaking landscape of majestic, gleaming marble palaces that had captivated over 27 million visitors. It was a place that looked like the Roman Empire had been resurrected in the American Midwest, a vision of the future built on a scale that seemed impossible for the 19th century. But as the sun began to set on that July day, that vision was being systematically erased. As the flames licked the towering, golden domes and the massive neoclassical columns of the world's Columbian Exposition, the world watched a masterpiece turn to ash. History books tell us it was a tragic accident, a fire started by a cold and hungry crowd of the dispossessed. They tell us these buildings were always meant to be temporary, just hollow shells built for a summer of celebration. But as the heat grew so intense that it melted steel and turned the lagoons into boiling cauldrons, one man stood among the wreckage with a perspective the public didn't have. He wasn't a tourist. He wasn't a politician. He was one of the last structural engineers still on the payroll, assigned to the high-stakes demolition crews tasked with dismantling the dream. He stood there, notebook in hand, watching the fire move with a speed that defied logic. He knew that what the public was seeing wasn't just a fire. He had spent months inside the skeletal remains of these giants, and he had seen things that didn't align with the official blueprints. In his private accounts, he made a claim that would haunt local historians for over a century. He claimed that the very substance of these buildings, structures that looked like they were built to stand for 1,000 years, was never what the public was told it was. Why were these architectural marvels, the greatest collection of buildings in human history, destroyed with such brutal, frantic speed? Why was the city so eager to burn what they couldn't easily tear down? And what did the men who laid the foundations truly know about the strange, resilient composition of the White City? Tonight, we step into the smoke of 1894. We look past the gleaming white paint and the filtered black and white photographs to uncover the testimony of the last man who helped destroy the 1883 World's Fair. We are going to find out what he claimed those buildings were actually made of, and why that secret was meant to die in the flames. The year was 1893, and for 6 months, the world had a new capital. Rising from the swampy marshlands of Jackson Park, Chicago, the world's Columbian Exposition was more than just a fair. It was a declaration of human supremacy over nature, art, and technology. It was a 600-acre marvel that seemed to materialize out of thin air, featuring 14 massive great buildings that surrounded a central water basin so perfect it was nicknamed the Court of Honor. This was the White City. It was a place where the air hummed with the first large-scale use of alternating current electricity and where the night was chased away by millions of glowing bulbs, reflecting off facades that looked like pure, unblemished Carrara marble. But as quickly as this utopia appeared, it was marked for death. We are told by the history books that the World's Fair was a temporary city. The narrative is clean and logical. Architects like Daniel Burnham and Frederick Law Olmsted needed to build a massive landscape in less than 2 years, so they utilized temporary materials to create a theatrical illusion. It was meant to be a fleeting dream, a Midsummer Night's fantasy that would be enjoyed by millions and then dissolved. But when you look closer at the archives, the timeline begins to feel strained. The sheer scale of what was constructed, buildings that could hold hundreds of thousands of people, foundations of deep-driven timber and iron, and structural steel skeletons that rivaled the great cathedrals of Europe, doesn't align with the idea of a disposable city. Why would a nation in the grip of a deep economic depression spend the equivalent of billions of dollars on structures meant to last only 180 days? And more importantly, why was the demolition process so frantic, so violent, and so absolute? This story matters because it sits at the intersection of American myth-making and industrial reality. For over a century, a persistent mystery has haunted the accounts of the engineers and demolition workers who remained on-site after the gates were locked. While the public moved on, these men stayed behind in a ghost city, tasked with unmaking a miracle. Their testimonies, found in dusty journals and local reports, speak of buildings that were incredibly difficult to dismantle. They describe materials that resisted the hammer and the axe, yet were consumed by fire with a terrifying chemical intensity. Tonight, we are going to peel back the white paint. We are going to look at the White City not through the eyes of the awestruck tourists, but through the eyes of the engineer who held the torch. We are exploring the strange reality of what lay beneath those gleaming surfaces and why the official explanation of temporary plaster might only be half the truth. This is the story of the last engineer, the secret of the staff, and the fire that was used to bury the evidence of what Chicago had truly built. To understand the mystery of the White City, we must first understand the impossible pressure under which it was born. In the late 1880s, Chicago was a city with a chip on its shoulder. It was a place of slaughterhouses, soot, and mud, a chaotic industrial hub that the refined elites of New York and Washington, D.C. viewed as a cultural wasteland. When Chicago won the right to host the world's Columbian Exposition, the city's leaders knew this was their one chance to prove they were more than just a gateway to the West. They didn't just want to host a fair. They wanted to build a neoclassical utopia that would rival Rome or Paris. The man chosen to lead this monumental task was Daniel Burnham, a brilliant and iron-willed architect whose motto was, "Make no little plans. They have no magic to stir men's blood." Burnham gathered the most prestigious architects, landscape designers, and engineers in America to Jackson Park. When they arrived, they found a desolate, swampy marshland. They had less than 24 months to transform 600 acres of mud into a paved, electrified, and grand city of palaces. The timeline was a death march for the laborers and engineers. Thousands of men worked around the clock, driving over 40,000 wooden pilings deep into the soft Chicago soil to support buildings that were designed to be the largest ever constructed. The Manufactures and Liberal Arts Building, for example, was so massive that it could have easily fit the entire standing army of the United States under its roof. But here is where the story gets complicated. Because of the extreme time constraints, Burnham couldn't use traditional marble or stone. Instead, the engineers utilized a structural innovation that was revolutionary for the time: massive steel and iron skeletons. These were modern skyscrapers in every sense of the word, built with the same structural integrity as the skyscrapers rising in downtown Chicago today. However, to give them their ancient look, the engineers coated these steel frames in a material called staff. Staff was a mixture of plaster of Paris and resilient hemp fibers. It was light, it was cheap, and when spray-painted white, it was indistinguishable from heavy stone. To the millions of visitors who walked the grounds, the buildings appeared as solid as the Parthenon. But the engineers behind the scenes knew the truth. They were building a contradiction: titanic, heavy-duty industrial skeletons wrapped in a delicate, temporary skin. The budget was astronomical, exceeding $28 million in 1893, billions in today's currency. Every building was outfitted with the latest plumbing, revolutionary AC electric wiring, and fire suppression systems. As the engineers watched the final coats of white paint being applied, a question began to circulate among the crews. If this was all just a temporary show, why were they building it with the structural strength of a fortress? Why was there so much iron, so much steel, and so much permanent infrastructure for a city destined to be torn down in 6 months? The foundation was laid, not just for the fair, but for a mystery that would ignite as soon as the gates were closed. By October 1893, the euphoria of the world's Columbian Exposition had evaporated, replaced by a cold, looming sense of dread. The gates were officially locked, and the millions of tourists who had marveled at the White City went back to their lives. But for the engineers and the skeleton crews left behind, the fairgrounds didn't just become empty. They became a fortress of silence. The United States was spiraling into the panic of 1893, one of the worst economic depressions in its history. Outside the fences, Chicago was a powder keg of unemployment and labor strikes. Inside, the dream city was beginning to rot. The original plan for the post-fair period was straightforward. The buildings were to be sold to a demolition company, dismantled, and the materials salvaged. A man named Chicago developer James Murphy won the contract, paying a mere $80,000 for structures that had cost millions to build. On paper, It was the deal of the century. He planned to sell the massive steel trusses and millions of feet of lumber for a massive profit. But as the engineers began the process of unmaking the dream, they hit a wall. The temporary nature of the buildings turned out to be a myth. As crews stripped away the white staff exterior, they realized that the internal structures weren't just simple wooden frames. The massive manufacturer's building, for instance, contained 12 million pounds of steel. The foundations weren't just sitting on the dirt. They were anchored into the earth with a complexity that made traditional demolition nearly impossible. It was becoming clear that the labor costs to safely dismantle these giants would far exceed the value of the salvaged scrap. The engineers were stuck with a sprawling city of palaces that was too expensive to take apart and too dangerous to leave standing. As the winter of 1894 set in, the White City underwent a dark transformation. It was no longer a symbol of progress. It was a sprawling, eerie squatters' camp. Thousands of homeless men, desperate for shelter from the brutal Chicago wind, scaled the fences. They moved into the hollowed-out hulls of the agriculture building and the machinery hall. They lit small fires to keep warm, huddled beneath the peeling plaster of Roman gods and goddesses. It was during this tense period that one of the lead demolition engineers began recording his observations. He noted that the staff, the material everyone claimed was just cheap plaster, was behaving strangely. In some areas where the staff had been exposed to the damp lake air for a year, it hadn't crumbled. It had hardened. It was becoming a shell that was remarkably difficult to pierce with standard tools. He began to question the temporary narrative. If these buildings were meant to be disposable, why were they growing more resilient with age? The tension between the city authorities and the squatter population reached a breaking point. The city wanted the fairgrounds cleared for the new park system, but Murphy's demolition company was moving at a snail's pace, hampered by the sheer difficulty of the task. Rumors began to circulate among the night watchmen and the engineers. Some suggested that the city was looking for a shortcut, a way to bypass the expensive, tedious labor of manual demolition. They needed the White City to disappear, and they needed it to happen before the world realized how permanent these temporary structures actually were. The stage was set for a catastrophe that felt less like an accident and more like a foregone conclusion. The breaking point arrived on the night of July 5th, 1894. For months, the White City had sat like a ghost, its gleaming white walls now gray with soot and peeling like dead skin. The tension in Chicago was at an all-time high due to the violent Pullman strikes, and the fairgrounds had become a volatile tinderbox. But what happened next wasn't just a fire. It was a physical erasure of history so intense that eyewitnesses claimed it felt like the sun had descended to the earth. The fire reportedly began in the terminal station, but within minutes, it was clear that this was no ordinary building fire. The last engineer on site watched from across the Grand Basin as the flames leaped with terrifying agility. He noted in his logs that the fire didn't just crawl. It seemed to explode from one palace to the next. The staff, that mixture of plaster and hemp, proved to be a double-edged sword. While it looked like stone, the hemp fibers acted like 1,000 tiny fuses embedded in the walls. The White City was essentially a city made of fuel, wrapped in a thin, deceptive mineral shell. The spectacle was hauntingly beautiful and horrifying. The great dome of the administration building, once the crowning jewel of the fair, became a massive chimney of fire. As the heat rose to thousands of degrees, the marble statues of Roman gods and winged victories began to glow red before disintegrating into white powder. The heat was so ferocious that the water in the Grand Basin began to steam. But the real shock came when the fire reached the massive steel skeletons that the engineers had so carefully bolted together. Under normal circumstances, heavy structural steel requires sustained, focused heat to fail. But the engineer observed something that defied the temporary narrative. As the wooden interiors and hemp-reinforced walls burned, the massive steel trusses of the manufacturer's building, the largest in the world, did not just sag. They buckled and snapped with the sound of cannon fire. The engineer claimed the heat was exacerbated by the very chemicals used to treat the staff to make it weather-resistant. It wasn't just wood and plaster burning. It was a chemical inferno. By 10 p.m., the Great Basin was a ring of fire. The thousands of people who gathered on the outskirts of the park didn't see a demolition. They saw a funeral pyre for the Gilded Age. The fire department was almost entirely helpless. The hydrants, part of a sophisticated system designed only a year prior, were failing or insufficient for a blaze of this magnitude. One by one, the palaces of electricity, machinery, and agriculture collapsed into mounds of glowing debris. When the sun rose on July 6th, the silence was absolute. The White City was gone. In its place was a blackened wasteland of twisted iron and mountains of white ash. The engineer, walking through the cooling ruins, made a chilling observation. The fire had done in one night what his crews had failed to do in 6 months. It had cleared the land. But as he looked at the melted puddles of what used to be structural steel, he realized the destruction was too perfect. The fire had consumed the evidence of the building's true complexity, leaving behind only the narrative the city wanted, that the fair was a dream, and like all dreams, it had simply vanished into thin AI in the cold light of the following morning. The White City had been replaced by a landscape that looked more like a battlefield than a fairground. The official verdict from the Chicago authorities was swift and convenient. The fire was a tragic result of the social unrest gripping the city. It was blamed on the vagrants and strikers, a narrative that allowed the city to bypass any further responsibility for the expensive, grueling process of manual demolition. But for the engineers who had to pick through the cooling iron and white ash, the accident raised more questions than it answered. The last engineer on the site began to document a series of anomalies that didn't fit the official story of temporary plaster and wood. First, there was the matter of the scrap. James Murphy, the contractor who had bought the salvage rights, found himself in a strange position. Much of the massive structural steel that was supposed to be his profit had been subjected to such extreme, localized heat that it was virtually worthless as high-grade scrap. Yet, curiously, certain sections of the foundations, the deep-driven timber and iron pilings, remained untouched, anchored so firmly into the Chicago mud that they were simply paved over rather than removed. Then, there was the testimony regarding the staff. While the public was told it was a simple mixture of plaster and hemp, the engineer noted that the debris left behind didn't behave like typical plaster of Paris. In the areas where the fire had been hottest, the material had vitrified, turning into a glass-like substance rather than crumbling into dust. He began to question if this staff had been treated with experimental fire retardants or chemical binders that were far more sophisticated than the simple recipes disclosed to the press. If the buildings were truly meant to be disposable, why were they built with materials that reacted so violently and complexly to combustion? This led to a much deeper, more persistent debate that still lingers in the corners of architectural history today. Some suggest that the world's Columbian Exposition wasn't just a fair, but a massive, full-scale test of modern urban infrastructure, a beta test for the cities of the 20th century. Others, moving into the realm of alternative history, have questioned if some of the structures were actually pre-existing or built with far more permanent intent, only to be reskinned and plastered to appear uniform. While mainstream historians dismiss these as conspiracy theories, the sheer speed and totality of the destruction, the way a 600-acre city was erased in a single night, remains a statistical anomaly in the history of urban fires. The most haunting question left in the ash was the why. Why was almost nothing saved? The magnificent statues, the intricate moldings, and the revolutionary decorative elements weren't moved to museums or sold to collectors. They were smashed and dumped into the lagoons to serve as landfill. The destruction was so aggressive that it felt less like a cleanup and more like a deliberate act of forensic scrubbing. It was as if Chicago was terrified that if the buildings stood for one more year, the world would realize they weren't the temporary stage props they were claimed to be. The fire didn't just destroy the buildings. It destroyed the evidence of how they were truly constructed, leaving behind only the photographs and the carefully curated legend of the dream city that had to die. The smoke over Jackson Park eventually cleared, leaving behind a scarred stretch of land that would eventually become a public park. But for the engineers who had walked those halls, the White City never truly disappeared. It remained as a ghost in their blueprints and a question in their journals. Today, we look back at the 1893 World's Fair as a pinnacle of American achievement, but the story of its destruction reminds us that history is often a carefully constructed facade. We see the gleaming marble in the old photographs, But the men who tore it down saw the hemp, the iron, and the calculated disappearance of a masterpiece. The claim made by that last engineer, that the buildings were something more than they appeared, invites us to look at our own modern world with a more critical eye. We live in an era of planned obsolescence, where we are accustomed to things being built to fail or to be replaced. But the World's Fair was the opposite. It was a city built with the strength of a fortress, only to be treated as disposable. It serves as a haunting reminder that a society's power isn't just measured by what it can build, but by what it is willing to destroy. Why was Chicago so eager to burn its greatest achievement? Perhaps the White City was too perfect. Perhaps it was a standard that the gritty, industrial reality of the 19th century couldn't actually maintain. By turning the palaces into ash, the city ensured that the fair would remain a myth, a flawless, shining vision that could never be tarnished by the slow rot of time or the reality of maintenance. They traded a physical legacy for a psychological one. They chose to give the world a dream rather than a city, because dreams are the only things that never have to prove their foundations are real. As we walk through Jackson Park today, the lagoons are still there, and the Palace of Fine Arts, the only great building saved and rebuilt in stone, stands as a silent witness to what was lost. Beneath the grass where families now picnic, the massive wooden pilings and the rubble of the other 13 palaces still sit in the dark Chicago mud. They are the literal bones of a giant that we weren't allowed to keep. The fire of 1894 didn't just end a fair. It closed a chapter of human ambition that we have never quite managed to reopen. The story of the last engineer is a warning. It tells us that the official narrative is often just this staff, the decorative plaster meant to hide the complicated, heavy, and sometimes inconvenient iron of the truth. We are left to wonder, if those buildings had stood, how different would our cities look today? If we hadn't been so quick to strike the match, would we still be living in the shadow of the White City's promise? In the end, the 1893 World's Fair proved that you can build a utopia in 2 years, and you can erase it in a single night. But you can never truly kill the questions left behind in the ash. The next time you stand before a grand monument, look past the surface. Ask yourself what lies beneath the paint, and why someone might be waiting for the right moment to watch it burn. Because sometimes, the greatest secret a building holds isn't how it stands. It's why it was never meant to last.